Hello, I'm Rabbi David Ingber, and this is Detours and Destinations from the 92nd Street Y. Conversations with deep thinkers about their journeys, both expected and unexpected, and the wisdom gleaned from the twists and turns along their path. Tonight we're doing something special. This episode is being recorded live in front of an audience here at the 92nd Street Y, and it's good to have all of you with us, as well as all of those who are online. I've heard 100 at least, and who knows how many more are going to be showing up. And as was announced already, just to say it again, our guest tonight is Rabbi Dr. Jay Michaelson. He was a writer, journalist, professor, and rabbi whose work spans the intersections of religion, law, spirituality, and LGBTQ advocacy. He is the visiting scholar at Emory University, at the Emory Center, for Psychedelics and Spirituality, and was a visiting professor at Harvard Law School in spring of 2025. We have a lot of ground to cover. And one of the things that, just looking out into the audience as well, and those who are online, if I were to say there's an podcast, there's like an original, like this is the essence of what Detours and Destinations is all about, it would be someone like my dear friend Jay. Jay and I know each other for over 20 years. And what's remarkable about you, Jay, is that you have so many twists and turns in your story, and what has drawn your heart and drawn your attention, drawn your prodigious mind and your expansive heart towards. We could spend like 3 days doing this podcast together. And so it's just a privilege to be sitting with you and to be able to engage with you in conversation.
That would be the Oi Rogan experience. The 4-hour mega podcast, nobody knew what they signed up for.
Right, that would be a different podcast. But as always, whenever I begin these podcasts, I ask the guest to give me and give our listeners a sense of what is a detour and what is the destination? Like, what does that even mean to you in the way that you think about your life? Or what does that look like for you?
I mean, I guess 20 years ago, I wrote a chant for our friend Shoshana Jedwab that she never actually performed, but it was just a 2-line chant that this journey is the strangest one, each step is the destination. And it's just, arriving in each interaction, in each moment of our public and private lives with some degree of presence, maybe an awareness of the sacred for us amateur mystics. So in a way, I mean, that's always, I've been more focused in that kind of destination. I think we can get into it partly due to my own background and who I was growing up. I was always amazed at those people who had the 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plan. Those people have been very successful. So I'm not, I just know that that's not how I envisioned a lot of my work. It was kind of what was drawing me to, again, that marriage of the sacred and the justice realm at any moment. And so that's led to a lot of things that look like detours, but it might have been a destination in that way.
So bring us back. So you said that growing up, a window into who you were growing up. What was your family like growing up? And take us back.
Oh, I was once a nice Jewish boy a long, long time ago.
You were once a nice Jewish boy.
Once upon
a time.
Yeah, I grew up in Tampa, Florida, mostly, and was in a kind of conservative Jewish world, conservative denomination Jewish world. I was talking with a friend about the kinds of moments where you look back and you see seeds of who you became. And so for me, I remember when I was at Camp Rama in the Berkshires for many years, 5 years as a camper and then again on staff, it was those walks in nature and some general sense of nature spirituality, nothing too sophisticated, but like a little bit. And then when I got a little bit older, I read a book called Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse, which is this amazing book, I think, about religion and spirituality. He was a religion professor at NYU for many years. And I learned the phrase, die before you die, which is a maxim from the Sufis, and I painted it on the wall of my staff housing at Camp Rama. Most people didn't do that.
Die before you die.
So there was like a big eye, looking out at whoever was visiting the room, and then on the eyelid was written, die before you die. So there were some signs early on that, that boy ain't quite right, to paraphrase. And that was always true alongside a very conventional background in some ways. I'm very privileged. I was very fortunate, having two loving parents, and it was, definitely growing up as a closeted gay kid in Tampa, Florida in the 1980s wasn't such an easy draw, but a lot, my emotional and material needs were met in a way that I now look back on as seeing as very fortunate. But there was always that misfit, and I was always drawn to those people who I would encounter mostly through books or media, who similarly were just like a little bit weird.
So being a little bit weird is like being in a world where destinations were pretty consistently mapped out, or like the milieu that we're in, there were expectations and so on. You're at Camp Rama, which for those who are listening who don't know what Camp Rama is, it's kind of a flagship summer camp experience for conservative the Jewish movement called the Conservative
Not where
Movement.
Mystics are made.
Right. It's like not a place where you paint die before you die.
So that was unusual.
A Muslim mystical the Sufi school, the ego dying, as it were, before you actually physically die. But you're drawn to that, and so you already know about yourself that you are within a kind of a conventional world. You are on the margins, or you're what you called weird. And also then your own sexuality also was a part of that. So
yeah, and it's always, I was just writing an essay actually that'll be in a volume coming out about what, quote unquote, I'm air quoting for people listening, what gay spirituality might mean. And I'm not sure that category has a meaning anymore, but that's the book anyway. And it was trying to tease out the forms of non-belonging. And again, I don't mean to paint this out as like a tragic story. It wasn't that. It was just, I was just really different from the people around me. And it's impossible, I think, to tease out, was I taking those walks in the woods by myself because I didn't fit into trying to hook up with the girl and do this and do the other thing? And you guys, you straight guys, you talk a lot about sports. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, we talked a lot about sports.
Like this ever renewing spring of conversation.
Yeah.
And I am parched. I do not. And, so which was the chicken, which was the egg kind of thing. Was it that sense of disinterest in what all the other boys were doing that led to that, or was I don't know. They're just different braids of difference that I experienced, and now I'm mostly thankful for that. I mean, I think both of those turns, the spirituality and the sexuality, I mean, that was certainly a huge piece of my work for a long time, professionally, but in terms of myself, now it's like boring to be some gay dad living in New Jersey. It's not that edgy, but
right. But when you're a young man, so in your experience now, thinking back, or maybe in your experience then, there wasn't a sense of alienation, or when you felt yourself to be different, when you felt yourself to be on the margins, or somehow not wanting to talk about baseball averages of did that make you feel isolated, or did you were able to find people who were similarly different than you?
No, I found, definitely by senior year of high school, like the freaks, we had our lunch table out on the outside of the cafeteria on the porch that we sat in all the time. But I was also really arrogant, right? So, I just thought everyone was stupid.
You're arrogant.
So I felt alienated, but I was alienated from a bunch of idiots. It wasn't,
Who wants to be part of that club?
And it was I'd read The Catcher in the Rye, I'd read Saw Dead Poet Society. Like, it was clear that the mainstream was stupid, and that I was proud to not be a part of it. Obviously, I don't mean to be glib. I mean, sure, of course, there was a lot of isolation and loneliness and alienation and self-hatred. And, I think one way it showed up for me was so after high school, college, I got very interested. I became like a nightstand Buddhist, which means you have Buddhist books on your nightstand.
Right.
So you don't necessarily practice or anything, but I was reading a bunch of Zen books and
I can imagine a lot of listeners are nightstand something.
Yeah, nightstand mystics. I don't know. So I was very interested in that, and at the time, my subjective experience, I took a seminar in sophomore year of college on Jewish mysticism, and I read, people who were really formative for us, Art Green, Danny Matt, and I felt like what I was looking for in these other contemplative traditions was also present in my Jewish tradition. What I didn't know at the time was that they had been influenced by all of it. I was reading what was actually a lot of hybridity, syncretism, and innovation, and thinking that, here's the real authentic thing that's come down from the Kabbalists. And in a way, I'm even grateful for that illusion, because it then propelled me into, now 30 years of study of Jewish mysticism. And that was kind of this period where everything seemed to be open in this way, but in fact it was open because it was closed. So sometimes people ask, I came out of the closet a little bit late, like late 20s, and I spent most of my 20s in a kind of semi-Orthodox practicing life. I was living in Jerusalem for a couple of years, and then when I came back, I went to law school, and people asked, did I delay coming out because I was frum, because I was religious? And actually, I was religious because I hadn't yet come out. It was like there was this channel for eros, spiritual eros, and connection and community that was so rich and juicy and amazing. And I'm really glad I had those years at Pardes in Jerusalem and living in this it's very challenging, as I'm sure folks in this community know, to have the same level of intensity in a progressive religious or spiritual space that you find in a traditional religious space. I could out you right now as still listening to all those tapes by these Hasidic rabbis that I can't believe you still listen to all the time, but I know he still does. And
okay, you got me.
there is an intensity in that holistic lifestyle.
Yeah.
That's very, very hard to replicate or even approach. And I was hooked. There was a moment where I thought I was going to move to Tzfat and, become
Northern
mystic,
Israel, yeah.
and to this mystical city in the north of Israel, which it's like Jerusalem's not religious enough. You go to, this little town in the north with all the Kabbalists, screaming in the valleys, doing their contemplative practice. Ultimately, I realized, I think, that it just was not, I couldn't be my whole self there. And instead, in my most recent book, which is a collection of short stories, there are some characters who try to make that choice, who try to have those very particular conduits of life force, and they live within those. And that was never going to work for me. So I've been to Burning Man 14 times, and just came back from a celebration of Beltane, a kind of earth-based New Year. And I'm not in the narrow conduits of Eros exactly. But there was that real pull, because that life was so rich. And at the same time, I was going to say this before, the way the closet showed up for me wasn't just around sexuality and gender, it was around who I want to be in the world, and which is kind of who I am now. But at the time, it was much more narrow, those were my dreams of writing a collection of Kabbalistic short stories. That's not going to really happen. What's going to happen is I'm going to go to Yale Law School and get a JD and maybe be an environmental lawyer, which is what I wanted to do at the time, which is a noble, aim, but was not connected to who I really am. And that's how it showed up. And it was only much later that I started to live in the way that would be recognizable. We were saying before we sat down, when we first met, be careful who you meet at a kiddush, because that's when David and I first
What's a kiddush? What's a kiddush?
After Shabbat service, people push each other out of the way to get gefilte fish.
Gefilte fish and crackers.
And crackers, right.
Other wholesome delicacies.
Right, other high sodium foods.
Exactly.
And back then, David was a little bit still in the closet, because you were living a more traditionally Orthodox life.
Right.
You weren't in the closet around sexuality, you were in the closet around spirituality.
Yes, sir.
And reading somewhat heretical books at the time while in that's how I was like that for about 10 years, but just in a different mode.
Yeah. It seems like the double helix of your life at that point, or at least the two things that we've been focusing on, I'm sure there are other threads here too, like spirituality and sexuality, and that the beauty of what you just said is that the whole image of being, beside yourself or in the closet or not truly inhabiting who you are, right? Those two things for you went hand in hand. The more you lived into who you were going to be, the more courage you had, or the more drive you had to just to be authentic to who you were, both in private and public, express itself spiritually and then also, of course, sexually. But it would be remiss not to mention one of the other things that I knew about you when I met you, after meeting you immediately, was that you're a man of many interests and many a prodigious mind, a prodigious desire to know and to study. And at one point in your path, you actually were writing a column for the Forward newspaper called The Polymath, which was a perfect descriptor of you. You had many interests. You had gone back to Yale for Yale Law School. You had JD from Yale. When I met you, you had a startup in technology.
I did, yeah.
And
God, that was a long time ago.
That's a really long time ago. And yet, side by side to all these intellectual pursuits, you had this deep yearning for spirituality and for contemplative practice in particular. I remember your interest in Buddhism moved from being a Buddhist nightstand interest into actual practice that was pretty extreme. I mean, you want to a little talk about the Buddhist period, because you eventually, not only do you write books that we'll speak to about Jewish mysticism and about your intellectual pursuits, but you write a book. At one point in your career, you wrote a book for next generation Buddhists, and so you spent time in the Far East.
Yeah, I think so. Right after we met at the Kiddush, we then met at the Eila Chaim Jewish Spiritual Retreat Center, and I sat my first silent meditation retreat there in 2002. And it was a 7-day retreat with Rabbi David and his wife Shoshana Cooper and Jeff Roth and Eliezer Sobel. And it was basically very Vipassana insight meditation influenced meditation practice in a Jewish container. So we weren't just, as one of our teachers once called it, denigrated it as saying meditation in a talis, meditation in a Jewish prayer shawl. It was actually infused with Jewish values, Jewish concerns, but it was still a core Buddhist practice. And after a few years of that, I really became curious about how that could deepen. And when I got a little bit deeper into in the Buddhist container, all of these practices made a whole different kind of sense, about seeing how the mind inclines toward grasping or toward aversion, toward pushing things away, seeing how the practice of mindfulness can create a little bit of space, that same kind of space that Viktor Frankl talks about, right? Between response and reaction, or what is it? Between stimulus and response, or like Lou Reed said, between thought and expression, there lies a lifetime, that space of freedom. And how meditation could enable the growth of that, both for our own personal liberation, whatever that means, or well-being, but also our relationships, also our lives as citizens, as people in the world. And so, yeah, I took the deep dive. I did a 6-week meditation retreat in 2004, and then after a breakup in 2007, I kind of had this moment of like, well, what do I want to do most in the world? And there was a space in my professional life too, and I'm really glad that I had the presence of mind to really think about that, because now, here all these years later, with a husband and a child and jobs, it's not so easy to, I just was like, well, I want to get as enlightened as possible, not fully enlightened.
The watch is clicking.
I was like,
ticking.
If I got a year, I'm going to do that. And so, yeah, I spent 2 months on retreat in Massachusetts at the Forest Refuge, which is part of Insight Meditation Society, and then went 3 months to Nepal to practice a kind of meditation that actually kind of develops linearly over time, which for meditators hearing this, that might sound like heresy, right? It's just about being in the present moment. Well, yeah, but you can also learn to be more present in the present moment. So it is ultimately the circle, it is ultimately about now, but we can learn in a linear way to be more present with now. And I was really into that. And so I did take those 5 months out, did a lot of practice, made some quote unquote progress, eventually taught one form of meditation. I got authorized to teach in a Theravadan Buddhist lineage called jhana, which is about cultivating these profound states of altered consciousness. No psychedelics, now through psychedelics, but at the time not. That was the center of my life. All along, my kind of Jewish devotional life was there. I used to say at that time that I had a pagan body, a Jewish heart, and a Buddhist mind, and that's how I. I still
encapsulates it.
I mean, that's still true now. I think because of becoming a parent, not a lot of parents get into psychedelics because they become parents, but I did. And
that's not a detour. That's definitely
that was clear.
That's clear.
It was clear that to cultivate the kinds of mind states that were conducive to life transforming insight takes time. and it takes the right conditions.
Yeah.
And, it takes a few days at least to just get the mind centered in that way. And there were tools that I remembered from 20 years earlier in my life, in my psychedelic period in my early 20s that, a lot of us have. And, that was the same time where our society's attitude toward these compounds were changing. And it was a re-embrace of this way to, again, for me, people engage in psychedelic use for all kinds of reasons, recreational, spiritual, personal, whatever. For me, it was kind of focused on that contemplative aspect. And so I haven't moved away from the Dharma internally, but in my work in the world, it's shifted from, I was working in the meditation world professionally for 5 or 6 years, and now working in the psychedelics field professionally is a continuation of those same interests.
Well, I want to come back to the psychedelics, but I just want to say that, yet again, in the back room before we started, I asked you, and you mentioned the first time that we met was at this free-for-all for sodium high, noshables, but we also crossed culinary paths at another juncture, which was your return from Nepal. I met you, I don't know if you remember this, down at Angelica's kitchen, down all the way down the village.
Okay.
And I met you, and your hair was completely shorn, like you had been a monk.
Right.
And I remember sitting with you, and I also, of course, those who know me, you know me well, maybe not the listeners, believe it or not, listeners might not even know my own story, but I was also deeply engaged in contemplative practice and had played with the idea of going for a long-term retreat. And I remember sitting with you in Angelica's kitchen and feeling your silence. It was really, it was a very profound moment for me to sit with you and to see and to witness the fruits of all of that practice that you had just engaged in. It was really memorable, clearly. So yet another detour, which of course is not a detour. It was another expression of your authentic self. You had time away, 5 months to go and practice, and you did it. One of the things about you, Jay, that I love is that you're one of these people that isn't satisfied with just reading about something. You're kind of like, oh, I want to go try that. Or
I'm an Enneagram 7, so that's really the story.
That explains it, yeah. And so you moved through that piece, that moment in your life, and meditation and contemplative practice has never, from the moment when you wrote Die Before You Die until today, it has always been for you a search for what's behind that, and what's the truth there, what's the more experiential truth, right?
And paradoxically, the non-search, right? The surrendering of the search, the letting go of the search. I mean, I wrote an essay 20 years ago called Stop Seeking, and that the spiritual search is the search to stop seeking, and I know you like a good pun and contradiction, so, but that's right. I think, and that's true. I was thinking in the framing of the podcast and anticipating what you might ask, there is a kind of contemplative through line that is true even when I'm sitting around the table on a CNN show today, what are my capacities to be more present and more, hopefully in some tiny way, contributing toward more compassion in the world. I mean, that sounds a little bit lofty and maybe self-centered, but just what are the ways in which I can show up more? And sometimes I succeed at that, and sometimes I fail. Luckily for me, there's a few platforms where I can try to kind of integrate this a little bit. Being the rabbi on CNN gives you a certain lane to talk in a way that is just how I've always spoken, but just gets received in a certain way, really talking about the ethics of a particular policy, or trying to remind us of the human cost of various policies. And obviously I have my political views, but just being able to do that and then trying in some way to maintain some composure in those conversations, and again, failing sometimes and succeeding others.
Right.
So, but it is really, and I think
it's both and for you. I mean, that is obviously the name of your Substack.
Yeah, I chose that for a reason.
Yeah, and so when, from the contemplative, and even from the beginning where you were in the conservative camp, but on the margins, there's something about you that is, I don't know, do you feel as if you were charged with the ability, or without being too theological about it, but that you have the capacity to hold many truths, a polymath, and a mind and a heart that through meditation you've been able to succeed in expanding how you live with various contradictions. I mean, even, I don't know, people who are watching tonight or people going to watch this eventually, I don't know if two rabbis have ever sat on a stage at the 92nd Street Y and talked about fairies and about meditation and about psychedelics. Like, there is a unique capacity that you bring to the table, which is the ability to span a very broad range of interests and topics, and that sit inside of you in a very easy way. Is that?
Yeah, I just prefer the word dilettante, but I'll take polymath.
Dilettante.
Yeah, they wouldn't let me use that in the. I don't recommend it as a career path. And it's funny, I was a visiting professor at Harvard this year, and I've had a lot of student meetings over the last few months, and obviously it's a very fraught time to be at Harvard, to be at law school, to be heading out into the legal profession. And so I loved, it was some of the most rabbinic work I've ever done, right? Just, being with these students and their uncertainty right now. And, there again, I was careful to say, like, I don't recommend this particular path of doing a lot of different things, but it does. So I've thought about writing a memoir about it, couldn't decide, did it all anyway, would be the kind of epitaph. But I don't want to suggest too much intentionality to it. It just seems to be like my constitution. And it's true now too, if I do too much, if the balance is out of balance, like, I get really itchy. So if it's just doing like spiritual work and all that stuff, I'm like, yeah, but what about the deportations, right? And then it's like, well, if I'm just doing the political work, I get really dry and I miss that, and something's missing, and so there has to be. So it's some kind of constitutional issue, not in that sense of
not in that sense, right? No, I got
about my constitution.
Your personal, yeah.
And that's been true. That has been true all along, I think.
We skipped a little bit, so I just want to go back. There are no detours to destinations, even in the podcast conversation. But you're coming back from Nepal. You're in your 30s, and where did the drive to be a rabbi come in? I know that it's at some point in your 30s. You're teaching meditation. You already have multiple degrees. You've studied for a master's degree in Jewish thought through Hebrew University, and you become fascinated. Not only do you kind of make it your vision to become a rabbi, but you're also really academically and intellectually grabbed by the persona of a number of very antinomian or marginalized figures, people who kind of broke Jewish law. One of them, of course, was Shabtai Tzvi, and the other one is Jacob Frank. So where did the Jewish thread reemerge after your time in the world of Buddhism? You write a book for next generation Dharma seekers, if you're a young Buddhist, and then you re-engage in Jewish life and you decide to become a rabbi. Can you take us through that a little bit?
It was mostly deciding not to become a rabbi. So when in my 20s, I would have only gone to either a conservative or an Orthodox rabbinic program, and they wouldn't have let me in. So that clearly wasn't going to be a path.
Because you were gay.
Yeah. And so that wasn't, and obviously there were liberal institutions that would have, but just from how I was wired at that particular time in my life. And then, I really resisted. I considered doing the Jewish Renewal Rabbinic Program, but I just didn't want to take on the projections that people have of, would a rabbi do this, would a rabbi do that? I imagined myself, I had some really fun night at Burning Man and not wanting the burden of rabbi doing that,
Ooh, rabbi, yeah.
And so meanwhile, at that same time, that's what I was doing. I worked for 10 years as an LGBTQ activist professionally, started 2 Jewish LGBT organizations and running spiritual retreats and other programs and doing a lot of that work. And I was already acting as a rabbi, not just with the Harvard students, but back then, 20 years ago now, with counseling young people about the coming out process or integrating their own spirituality and sexuality. So I was already doing that work.
You didn't have the degree, but people already...
It was already...
You were rabbiing.
I was rabbiing, exactly. And I also had the book knowledge.
Right.
From the master's work and from being in yeshiva. And so I had all of the pieces. But I just didn't want it. And then so what year would that be? 2013. So now I was 42. And David Cooper was retiring from meditation teaching. And he and Shoshana were going to pass on the lineage of that retreat to me and to our friend Beth Resnick. And it was my idea. I was like, well, why don't we just make this, if you're passing on this lineage to me, we have in Jewish tradition a ritual to do that, and it's smicha, ordination. And so he went for it. Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi went for it. Rebecca Alpert went for it. These were the three people who were my Beit Din, the official people kind of signing. And then you were also signed. David also signed the smicha certificate, and many others who are, not many others, a few others who were close teachers and friends. And at that point, I was just over it. Now I'm fine to take the projections of what people think a rabbi is or isn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter to me. And I don't...
Does it also work in a way because you get to be the...
Yeah, I use it to my advantage. I mean,
Right.
It just became clear that doing the kind of justice work and journalism work and whatever, that it just was like, it wasn't changing who I was, but it changed how I was perceived in a way that I think was really positive. And it does change who I am a little bit. It changes how I express myself. It changes, like, I don't just say, I mean, I may have just changed how I speak anyway, but I wouldn't just kind of make some point, that's derogatory to someone, or, we obviously live in a time of incredible vulgarity and truthlessness in our public lives, and I definitely don't want to contribute to that anyway, but having that rabbi piece maybe raises the stakes a little bit, because it is perceived as speaking in some relationship to this tradition, and so I do take that very seriously, but I kind of got over the more, I also got older. I just wasn't doing as much exciting stuff.
But Jacob Frank and Shabbat Tzvi, these two characters that I mentioned, were known to have been rabbinic, let's say, spiritual leaders, both of whom had messianic followers. Shabbat Tzvi in particular, the false messiah of Izmir, and then Jacob Frank, whom you wrote your PhD and eventually wrote a book that became an award-winning book here, a National Book Award winner.
National Jewish Book Award.
Now Jewish Book Award, but
still something. But I don't want to,
I'm not pooh-pooh it. I mean,
I'm not poo-pooing.
It's just Jewish. That's true. National Jewish Book Award winning, but it's quite something. Just share with listeners who might not know who Jacob Frank was, who he was, and also why it fascinated you, and if there's a parallel between the way that he comported himself, not like being an outlier of sorts, being someone who taught from the margins and who included things that the establishment, as it were.
Yeah, so I went to Israel after having spent a few years there to continue my graduate work, and realized that that the container of the PhD program was the right way to do this. And I went to write on Hasidism. I went to write on Rav Aaron of Saraselya, who was, this wonderful non-dualistic Hasidic teacher who features in one of my books, a book called Everything is God. Which
is an incredible book. Just plugging that book. It's a life-changing book. You also wrote a book before that called God in Your Body, which is also a profoundly important book about the body in Judaism. Most people think of Judaism as just kind of a head, and you embodied it. And then in Everything is God, you actually presented a book that I think a lot of people were waiting for many, many years, those who had studied other mystical and non-dual traditions. So Everything is God. So after that, you were studying Aaron of Shela, yeah.
So I was studying, and you need, when you're forming a project for dissertation, you need a question. Like, what's the question, at least in the humanities, what's the question you're trying to investigate and answer? And I just didn't really have a question about him that was that interesting. It was frustrating that, he had this amazing theology, and yet at the end of the day, like, he found a way to just make it about, Torah and mitzvahs, like the traditional Jewish way. And it just, I felt like the answers were predetermined. Meanwhile, I didn't know that this figure who you've mentioned, Jacob Frank, his oral teachings, which had been transcribed in the late 18th century, had actually been translated in a not very good English translation, and also in a not great Hebrew translation. And I found them in the Hebrew University Library and took them out, and I was just totally seduced, because you have no idea where anything's going to come out. Like, it was so startling, and it was this fascinating, creative, theological, philosophical writing that I felt like scholarship had gotten completely wrong. They focused on like a few, maybe things that didn't even happen, but might have happened, a sexual ritual here, or like a transgression. And like, maybe it did happen, again, as in the book, I'm pretty clear, I don't think we'll really ever know, and made that the center, and discarded this whole theology, which was totally radical and fascinating and mythic and weird and esoteric. And so I was really seduced, and it was intellectually, and it was just fantastic. And so that's how I switched to, but I do want to say, like, he was never and is never my spiritual teacher. Like, Jacob Frank was he's kind of an 18th century cult leader. He was very, I think, abusive toward his followers. His teaching is bold and remarkable, but also, often so radical as to seem destructive. And so I never want to put him out, and I'm hopefully clear in the academic book I'm not putting him out as like a paragon.
Right.
But I do think he's really fascinating. And I think that there's a way in which he and Shabtai Tzvi anticipated a lot of what we now take for granted about contemporary Judaism, that you could have a profound spiritual life without it being in the traditional Jewish frame, that law, sometimes Jewish law, sometimes represses or constrains more than it liberates. These are things which I think we might take for granted, but in the late 18th century were pretty radical, and all with these remarkable stories, one of which Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav appears to have plagiarized. There's just like a fascinating figure. And it was really more of a passion project. I was doing a lot of other work in the world, and I just really wanted to get this out there. And luckily, a few years delayed by the pandemic. I had my daughter was 2 during the pandemic, so my manuscript delivery date of September 2020 was missed. But I was able to do it, 6 months, a year later, and the book's out.
So what about you in terms of that persona? Like, if I think about you and kind of writing now your life at your kind of midway point, God willing, you're someone who's from a very early age kind of thought outside of the box. You saw yourself as outside of the box. You also had a bit of an elitist. I mean, you said it. I mean, you kind of like, it helped support your own alienation.
In a sort of like John Hughes way, like not, or Heather's or something.
Is that part of your rabbited, part of the way that you teach and the way that you think about the world, is that the heretical or that which is outside, that which is weird, though, is also actually something that is deeply needed for the whole, right? That there's something profoundly important that's being brought in, that's being seen from the outside, that can't be seen by those who are on the inside. This kind of like, and that it wakes people up, or what is that?
I like that reading. It's also a very kind of a nice queer reading, right? That it's the outsider within who can see the limitations, like Oscar Wilde is able to write The Importance of Being Earnest because he's both within that society and standing outside it and can see its hypocrisy or something like that, and also its hilarity. I think it was around 15, 20 years ago, I stopped believing that weird Judaism was going to make normal Judaism that much better. And I started celebrating it for its own sake. And, obviously it goes without saying that it's just like the layers of complexity and pain in the Jewish community right now just continue to twist and turn and increase. Like, you would think that, October 7th, and then the post-October 7th, and then the war and divisions over the war, and now, like, the weaponization of charges of anti-Semitism and how much is real, and it's like, it seems to just never end, this, like, miserable time to be Jewish. And also, it's this amazing time to do Jewish stuff in America, not in isolation from all that pain, but right along with it. And I may not agree with every particular fringe form of Judaism that's happening here, there, or the other, but I feel really in community and in common with them. And I don't know. I guess I don't have a fatalistic view. I mean, it's certainly clear that, for example, like if we think about the innovators of Jewish renewal, right? So Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach's tunes are sung in ordinary, congregations around the country, if not around the world, and people have whatever nice spiritual experience they have, and that's great, right? And it brings the community together, and great. And same with some of the innovations of Reconstructionism, of Jewish renewal. So I don't want to be like fatalistic about it, but I wouldn't say that my main interest in these subterranean or whatever forms of Jewishness is to transform the mainstream. It's to be with my eco-Jewish friends and my activist Jewish friends, even the ones I disagree with, and the artistically centered Jewish friends and the food-centered Jewish, like I just love all that stuff. And there is this real efflorescence of Jewish innovation. And, so as I mentioned before, I'm working in the psychedelics field. We had a conference at Harvard in March. Over 700 people attended either in person or online. We had psychonauts, psychedelic experiencers and explorers from Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right? We were able to negotiate and figure out a way for for faith leaders from each of the three traditions to just have a ritual recognizing very briefly the moment that we're in, right? It was a silent ritual, like lighting a candle together, right? Leaders from each of the three faiths, and that was created by the Muslim contingent that was there. And we realized there was no way to create a statement that was going to work, and so we didn't try to do that. And we had these amazing conversations about what spiritual practice looks like, both in the actual historical past, in imagined pasts, and in the present. And I don't know.
Does that bother you? I mean, I'm just listening to the story, and it feels very not Jay Michaelson to me in a certain way.
Really?
Because I'll tell you why.
This is like the essence of my work.
No, I know. I know the essence of your work now. Just like here we are, like along the continuum of your life, right? You're again in, knowing that you're involved in psychedelics at Harvard, like Timothy Leary, but like those two names together are both and, like the margin, or what was marginal now moving from the periphery towards the center. But in a way, so much of your life also over the last 30 years has been the refusal to bifurcate between the political and the spiritual. Like you move back and forth within them, saying both and, both and, both and yet at this moment, it seems like we've become so fractious that the only way that we can get together politically, spiritually, is if we recognize that there's no way to speak into the political without creating more division. So we have a silent ritual with a candle, which is beautiful. I'm not saying, right, lighting a candle in the dark is awesome, and holding silence is also awesome, but does it speak to, have you ever seen the kind of divisions and the kind of extreme polarization that we experience now in the Jewish world or outside the Jewish world before? And how does someone like you, who's great, maybe your superpower, is the ability to be both and, right? The ability to be both and at this moment. How do you navigate that, and how can we navigate that?
Well, that's a small question.
Yeah.
Can we talk about something?
I just thought, like, before we finish, we have to. Psychedelics, and psychonauts.
Look, I think at the Psychedelic Symposium, and we just got a grant. We're going to put some videos online and generate some materials from it. So I'm very excited to do that over the summer. We were there to talk about a thing, but there was also an elephant in the room. We weren't there to talk about the elephant. I think if we were, we could have gone beyond silence. But it felt, and this came from me, personally, from me as the person with Professor Noah Feldman convening the symposium, it just felt insane to have no gesture toward the reality of what we're experiencing. And, on both, particularly just do Jewish and Muslim, leave out the Christian contingent that was there were some very traditional Jews who were there, including people who are, fairly right-wing on Israel-Palestine stuff. There were some anti-Zionists who were there. There was like a wide range, right, just within the Jewish community. So it'd be hard, if not impossible, to imagine just a statement for the Jews, right? Let alone, and then, one of the participants on the Muslim side is Palestinian American, identifies that way. That's is of that, nationality, right? And there were some more liberal Muslims, and there were some, it was definitely like. So I think what we really wanted to talk about were the convergent and divergent aspects of our spiritual paths and how they're being transformed and revitalized in this new moment with these new technologies. But it was fraught going in. It was fun to be having a conference that we were worried equally about being protested from the left and the right at the same time. We had no idea. There was very both and, right? I mean, it was under the auspices of the program of Jewish and Israeli law at Harvard Law School. And I checked in, each of the Muslim participants, needed to feel okay with participating in that program sponsoring a conference, which, I was real. And then, there were folks who felt that some statements that some people had made online were anti-Semitic and that they shouldn't be platformed. That was coming more from the right side and the Jewish side. And, we were worried that like the anti-Israel protesters would protest because of the thing and the pro-Israel and then we thought, well, we're having such a nice gathering inside the building. Maybe there could be a nice gathering outside the building, and the protesters from both sides could hang out. That didn't really happen.
Yeah.
There were not a lot of protests. But I don't. The level of kind of chaos and detachment from balance, that's not really a thing, but those are the words that are coming to just imbalance, and the rage that people feel pretty much, on a lot of sides of these political spectra does feel a little bit new. We're not the first people to muse on that. I do remember lots of intense divisions in the past as well, but people do feel really, really strongly. And ironically, what really does unite the right and the left is how strongly they feel about stuff and each other. And it is this moment that, the Yeats' phrase is that the center cannot hold, but this polarization cannot hold either. So I don't make predictions, and I don't know where it goes from here.
But your contemplative practice, though, you said earlier about how important your ability to be quiet, to be silent, to watch, to be witness. And even when you're on CNN, you said, even when you're in, in the spotlight or under the lights, right? Do you find that capacity is, that it helps you hold your center? And also, does it have a shadow side? Like, does the witness capacity to be mindful of whatever is arising in the heart or the mind at a given moment, does it lead towards a kind of quietism or a kind of like, a passivity, but not for you, but do you see it manifesting? How are you navigating that?
I don't see it leading to quietism. I see it leading to resilience. I think you can use anything you want to escape. So, and I don't think meditation is a particularly good vehicle for that, because you're present with what's happening. TV is probably a lot better, right? Or like lots of like alcohol use or something. I think there are better ways to just try to escape than this. But I really see my own frailty in this as much as anything else. Like there's just, I definitely have a one strike and you're out rule on social media. I create.
What's that?
Like, I just am not, when I enter into, like, for my professional social media, fine, sure. I want everybody to engage. But in my personal life, I don't have a high bar to blocking. And it's just for my mental health. And I'm very aware that is part of the problem. That's part of the atomization and the bubbleization. But, I'm just very aware of my own limitations, of where I get triggered, and I sort of wish I didn't care about politics right now, and I wish I could. I have plenty of work to do on the non-political side of my work, and in a way, the Harvard stuff's been a blessing because I haven't had time. I've only written for the Forward once in the last 6 months, and I'm not boycotting the Forward. I just haven't had time. And because I've been focused on the academic work, and maybe that's been a blessing. So I can talk about my own experience a lot, but I don't want to hold myself out as having any answers as to how to really engage skillfully in this period, because it's what I'm still working on.
Mm. What do you find has been the greatest challenge to your spiritual practices, your spiritual attainments, the political environment, or having a family? I mean, I know for myself that I'm a bad example maybe with 3 boys and, starting a synagogue that grew exponentially within 6 years. We had hundreds of members, but I knew that I think that the last time I sat in a silent retreat, and for those who've never sat a silent retreat, by the way, going all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, maybe some of you are here when I know people who are listening going, silent retreat, I can barely be silent for more than 15 minutes at a time. That would make me crazy. But once you've actually experienced silence in a very strong container, in a retreat, you move through those kind of those very difficult days to a really profound discovery of
Yeah,
your
it gets
own.
way easier the longer you do it.
Exactly. And so you can exponent, like there is an inverse, obviously, relation between the number of days I sat in silence and then the number of children that I had and members in my community and the projections that you were speaking to earlier of being a rabbi. So which of those two is more difficult for
Well, I will say that
through?
like our first anticipated year of sleepaway camp is next year, so I've been maybe freighting it too much. I'm going to do the Kamado Kodo pilgrimage in Japan. I'm going to do a silent meditation retreat. I'm going to go back to Burning Man. I'm going to do all the Jay Michaelson stuff. So that's a really good question. I mean, I think definitely I do actually, even parenting a toddler in a global pandemic is not my recommendation to anyone wanting to follow a contemplative practice, but obviously that just becomes the arena of your spiritual practice. And if we look, it's one of the advantages. Judaism's really almost unique among religious traditions to not have a monastic tradition of any size, only small things around the margins. Like the ideal life is householder life. And that shifts how we see spirituality. That's like that metaphor of Ratzova Shov, like we're going back and forth between expanded mind and everyday mind, between seeing the world in an approximation of how we imagine the infinite seeing the world, just in pure radiant awareness, and we're all just waves coming up and going down. And then, wondering about why didn't my partner wash the dishes?
Right.
And that
Why
happens,
didn't they? I mean,
that could happen really fast. That oscillation. I just wrote an article called "The Oscillation of Spiritual Practice." That oscillation.
Love that article, by the way.
you.
Substack, both and. It's not just that Jay is a both and person, but also
That's the name of the.
That's the name
Thanks
of the
for doing
Substack.
my advertising for me. One thing I've never learned is
That's
marketing.
my job.
That oscillation can happen really fast, and yet I do see it as like that's part of the invitation.
Yeah.
Like that's, I don't know if I believe in future lives or not, but like definitely like YOLO, you only live once, is kind of how I've been living this life. And this feels like part of the great human invitation. It's also possible, obviously, to lead a fully actualized human life without children or biochildren or whatever. But it did feel like this was an invitation I wanted to accept. And being a gay couple, that also took a tremendous financial investment and a lot of time too. So fine, I think the answer is politics to your question. I think it's funny though, I do remember being on some of those early meditation retreats at El Chaim and spending, this will like disclose my surprise liberal political views. I spent a lot of time wasted on those retreats thinking about Dick Cheney. And this was the 2000s, and it was just like, he was just the embodiment of everything I could not stand. And what irked me about it too is I was pretty sure I had a big disagreement. We actually may have argued about this. So all of my spiritual friends would say, well, like, don't worry, he's really unhappy inside. And I was like, no, I don't think so. I think he's a happy dude. I think he has a set of values that he is patriotic in a certain way, and he is, capitalist in a certain, like he is, and I actually think he's really happy, and I would spend a lot of wasted time on retreat, like trying to puzzle my way through that. And I felt, I feel worse.
I can only guess what you're thinking about.
Right. Now I do feel worse about the politicians of this moment compared with that, but I also felt pretty bad at that time too. And so I am mindful. I think I've been really drawn to the darker teachings of spiritual traditions. Like the hardest to take lines from Kohelet, from Ecclesiastes. Or, in Western Buddhist circles, there's often a like, oh, Buddhism's not so anti-world. Buddhism's great. You can like totally have both and in that way. Actually, a lot of Theravadan Buddhism is really kind of like, this world is going to be filled with suffering because humans are driven by greed, hatred, and delusion. And like that accords with a certain understanding of evolutionary biology. But like, it's not that that's the only thing there is in the world, but that it's unavoidable, that in this life, pain is mandatory. And, when you try to get involved in the affairs of kings and princes, you're getting into that big pond of dukkha, of suffering. And that's what it's going to be.
It's not a rabbanut.
And don't have, right. And like, so I've drawn comfort from those parts of the tradition that maybe 20 years ago I would have tried to whitewash. But I think back to your question, definitely, I mean, I knew it going in. I also consented to the family thing, right? This was a choice. This is affirming. I can regret my choice, but it was a choice I made. But I didn't choose the world in which we're living in 2024.
Right. But the spiritual wisdom, I guess I'm wondering if you can weigh in on something that I'm always struggling with, which is that as you make your way into what you call this big ocean of dukkha, suffering, or in our tradition, the world of sheker, the world of lies, the world of deceptions, the world of form, right, this world, there's also a place where discernment between compromise and settling, which is a kind of form of maybe delusion, can replace integration as like I'm integrating, like I'm a householder, I like nice things. There's nothing wrong with nice things. I mean, we know, you and I both know, in the Jewish spiritual tradition, there were, in the Hasidic tradition in particular, there were very, very wealthy rabbis, wealthy teachers whose practice, as they said, and we can put an asterisk next to this or not, was to work in the realm of acquisition and acquisitiveness, and how you work with that. Like, you're certainly not. We both are not where we were when we met in the 30s, where, living.
You're not working at Carmine's?
Not working at Carmine's at a restaurant on the Upper West Side, and you're not, with a backpack making your way around, starting, incredible not-for-profits. Like, we're both, men in our 50s, and we both have children and a family. So how does one know if one is integrationist or one is a compromising person?
These are such softball-y questions I've been getting. I thought we were going to talk about, so tell me about your peak experience.
Well, you know what, we could, after this, tell me about, we have about 10 minutes. I would love to hear a peak experience.
No. I mean, I think a lot of it's karma. I feel like both of us have acquired a degree of platform and privilege. And I feel, I used the word before, itchy, when I don't use that for people who are being marginalized right now and pretty severely oppressed right now, and for the structure of the rule of law as I understand it, and higher education and all, and the climate crisis and so on. So I feel like, before I said I wish I didn't care about politics so much, but there is a gift in that, which is that I don't know, I don't have to remind myself to do the right thing. It's just like an itch, you know? And sometimes I wish I didn't feel it.
Well, you told us about a non-peak experience, which I think is a really important disclosure. Like, you're sitting on a meditation retreat thinking about Dick Cheney. You're telling us that there's some inner compass, for you at least, that you're always navigating, right, wanting to make the world a better place, or thinking about how the world can be a better place, and also your own spiritual attainment, your own spiritual evolution. Is that true?
Yeah, there's just, I feel, I didn't invent it, right? There's the Ben Adam Lamakom and Ben Adam L'Chavero. There's two kinds of commandments in the Jewish tradition. One, what we owe the divine, which to me is like our spiritual practice, our devotional practice, our recognizing our contingent fragility on this planet. And the other, what we owe each other, what we owe human beings, that we shouldn't oppress the widow or the orphan or the stranger, because we know, we the empowered, the we of that verse, we the people with power and privilege, should know, or should imaginatively force ourselves to know what it is to be marginalized, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, right? We just finished, as we're recording this, the holiday of Passover a few weeks ago. That's all about imagining an experience of unbelievable oppression so that we can build empathy. So it's not like J Torah, it's just the Torah, right?
But clearly, if Dick Cheney is not born with it, or people like that, you were born into a milieu where you really, deeply, you internalize that.
I want to make space too. I don't want to. I do want to make space for a very different reading of some of those same verses. That there's a view that the Jewish people are in danger, and that there needs to be more strength and maybe less compassion. There's definitely a view that American people, construed in what I would say is a very narrow way, are also in a kind of danger, and that there needs to be more strength and less compassion. And I'm not both sidesing this, and I'm not equating. I have my view. I've taken my side now for 35 years, but there is, I don't want to just say there the other side is evil or mistaken or something. I do think they're mistaken, but that's not the whole story. But it is the case that for me, and I just was able to see this, maybe some of it is that experience of marginalization and othering. Obviously, like being some closeted kid in suburban Tampa in the 1980s is not the same as being a slave in Egypt or in any other context, but it was a little taste of what it's like to be on the wrong side of oppression. And certainly, I think one of the ways the Jewish tradition, the Jewish experience of suffering could be nourishing, is to have that empathy. But as we've seen, it also can lead to the opposite conclusion, right? We've been attacked. We have to be strong so we don't get attacked again, and strong in a pretty harsh way. So it's not like a guarantee, but that part feels very clear to me from a kind of presence level. And, the Buddhist way to say it is wisdom and compassion, the two wings of the phoenix, the mythical, right, the Garuda bird, right? That wisdom is the way seeing how things really are. And from that wisdom, we should naturally just feel compassion. Ultimately, everything might just be the divine, and this might be, like Elon Musk says, we might just be living in a simulation. But if you're suffering in the simulation, that really sucks, right? And it doesn't feel like you're in a simulation when you're suffering in wherever place that you are. And I don't know, for me, that's really generative, just like Heschel said, right? Like we have this experience of radical amazement, and the response to that is not like, oh, I'm going to get me my next experience of radical amazement, right? It's how do I live the rest of my life in a way that does integrate this consciousness of radical amazement, and praying with your feet, marching with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that might be one of those ways.
Heaven here, like bringing heaven here, as it were, in that language, bringing heaven right here on earth. So I just want to, last couple minutes here, I'm gonna share a peak experience. I would love to hear a peak experience for you. But like, I just want to say, as a friend and somebody who's been a fellow seeker with you, and we've been in kind of parallel paths in many ways. But there were times when
I would never have started a synagogue.
Right.
I know I feel good about the things I can do well.
Right.
And navigating 400 families and social relationships and politics. God bless
well,
you.
You're smarter than me too, and so that's clear. And I do remember being on a silent retreat where you actually were the teacher. I sat with you once, and I remember vividly. And I won't actually say what you told me because it was private, but I remember the advice that you gave me that when we sat together when I was having some struggles in that meditation retreat, and it stayed with me. Another experience of mine with you, I'm like naming peak experiences with you, obviously my wife and my kids, right? But also I remember visiting you at a country home and being blown away by, first of all, you again, dabbled with music, but you're also an incredibly prolific and beautiful poet. And I have your poetry that also touched me. And you wrote a book about tears and about the gate of tears, about the power of tears. And so you've, just thinking of the way you've impacted my life. All of the conversion students that I work with read God in your body. Some of them, not all of them, if they're up to it, can read Everything is God. And I certainly know that whenever I read something that you write, I walk away thinking about something. I remember phrases like you once wrote a piece called "Fetishizing the Trigger," which was
That's a good one.
It was a great phrase that I still think of in my mind about how the means towards the end should not be confused. Right? If we're seeking God, don't make all the things in between it into gods, as it were, and we fetishize the trigger. So yeah, share something. I know you've been obviously working for advocacy for psychedelics now. It's a major part of your life because we need to be advocating for psychedelics. They do such incredible studies and over again are showing how much it can help people with PTSD and people who are suffering, immense alleviation of their suffering. But you're also dabbled with some Syrian rue, which is another root that has to do with potentially Hebrew mysticism. I don't know. Share something with us,
Well, thank you for all that. And yeah, I mean, maybe it goes without saying because it's your podcast, but like the impact you've had on almost everyone I know in the Jewish world. Also really profound, and I'm in awe of the spaces that you've been able to create over the years. But I have to say that what stands with me actually was you and I were talking a long time ago, and I was telling you about some of my peak experiences and then how I doubt whether they were actually true. And you looked me in the eye and you're like, "You doubt your peak experiences?" I was like, "Yeah, totally. I totally want to doubt my peak experiences." It's like, look at the world we're living in with like theocracy around, and people have a peak experience and then they're like convinced of a particular religious dogma or like something must be true or like and that's on the left, the right, everywhere. Like just and right now the ascendance of a really intense spiritual, charismatic, hard right Christianity should really, right? I mean, these are not the not spiritual people, right? These are the people entering altered states all the time and having profoundly strong religious and political convictions as a result of their personal spiritual experiences. So I do doubt my peak experiences, and I'm kind of okay with that in a way. I mean, I think there have been a lot of those kinds of experiences. And in tech bro speak, I optimized for spiritual experience, which is how there were so many detours that turned into destinations to bring us full circle to the beginning. Like it was seeing that there was a possible destination in this practice or that practice. And whether it's immersing in the Ari mikvah in Tzfat, the ritual bath, I guess is the translation, and a cold spring, or dancing at the tomb of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, this chassid outside of Tzfat, or being, in Nepal and just recognizing that even if I don't get the enlightenment thing or whatever this experience is, that there's an okayness. There's a basic okayness this is what Buddhists call the one fortunate attachment. That there's the resting in awareness that is really impossible to describe, but so far has been pretty much always accessible for these last 17, 18 years since the first time that opened up for me. And that's true right now. And it's true with my family. And it's true at my desk where I just exhale for a bit. And I teach this on the Substack, so it's not like an esoteric practice, but letting go of this intensely difficult moment that I'm writing about. And it's just now.
Well, Jay Michaelson, Rabbi Dr. Jay Michaelson, from your very prescient young Jay, who was not only drawn to dying before you die, but then put it up on the bunk in Rama through the various other Jays, the so many Jays, the Jay of the academic Jay, the journalist Jay, the contemplative Jay, the meditation teacher Jay, the rabbinic Jay. All of the different Jays, Dad Jay.
We need a new Brian
Jay.
Wildsmith, like what's a flock of blue jays?
Yeah, exactly. So through all of them, the through line that you yourself said is this playing with detours and destinations, that all of the detours really were in some way something in you, leading you, and you following it to the next destination and the one after that. I think we could talk for hours. Unfortunately, we're done for this session. But I would love to talk to you again and again and again and get into many more areas of your really fascinating journey and the ways that you're making an impact in the world and the way that you're a blessing in the world. So I just want to thank you for sharing your detours and your destinations with us tonight.
Thank you, David. Whether it's at Le Pan Quotidien or here on the 92nd Street Y stage, it's always good to
It's awesome.
with you.
And a thanks also to our team, to Efrat Bigger, who's our producer, to Maya Geyer, who's our editor, and to Shimon Smith for their wonderful music. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y and to the stage crew tonight, Sean, Walt, Ellie, Donnie, and Raphael. And also, of course, special thanks to Eden Sidney Foster. I want to thank also the Bronfman Center and its team, Jacob and Sharon and Rachel. I'm your host, Rabbi David Ingber. This was Detours and Destinations. See you in the next episode next Tuesday, and until then, may all of your detours be destinations. you.